The views expressed in this video are solely those of the host and the guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of any organization or entity that may be affiliated with. We encourage the viewer to conduct their own research. Hi there, welcome to another episode of the PackBreakers, a show dedicated to tobacco harm reduction and the people of tobacco harm reduction. To be honest, this is not a normal format of the PackBreakers. This could be considered a poke the bear or bust a myth, and that's where I want to take a look at a particular section or topic, subtopic of tobacco harm reduction or vaping in this case, and delve into it and provide some context and some input that I feel that is not being shared or not being clear enough. And today's discussion or my discussion or what I want to ventilate here is to do with youth vaping in South Africa. Now, I'm going to be honest, I am quite torn on this particular topic, given the fact that I am a father, I am married to a pediatrician, and therefore child welfare and child health is critical to me and to my family. However, in saying that, I believe that this particular conversation is missing a lot of context, and it's not demonstrating that there is a lot of selection bias in this discussion. I'll be the first one to accept or acknowledge that we need regulations in South Africa with regards to vaping, and I'll be first in line to highlight the fact that we do definitely need part of the regulation that prevents the sale of any nicotine product to people below the age of 18. I would also agree with that some of the marketing, advertising, and packaging of these products are not appropriate for the youth, and that they could very easily be seen as trying to attract the youth. And I would believe that we need some level of regulation that prevents that from happening. However, it doesn't mean I accept the entire bill as it stands currently before Parliament. I think there's a lot in that bill that's wrong that could create a far worse situation. But in terms of protecting the youth with regards to the sale and supply of these products, 100% agree. In terms of ensuring that the packaging, the marketing and advertising is appropriate and does not entice the youth, like cartoon characters, strange names, I would have to agree. In terms of flavors, we cannot touch those flavors unless the flavor has been proven or shown to be harmful. I mean harmful, not just a little bit of harm, but harmful. And I believe standards are where the focus should be. So let's get into some of the things that I was going to say. And what prompted me to do this particular video was actually a couple of weeks ago, I was invited to be part of a television conversation or conversation on TV with regards to my view on youth vaping and my view of this particular study. And during this process of being invited to the show, a question was posed as to what I would be sharing or what my key points are with regards to this discussion, which I highlight some of the stuff that I'll be showing today. And that prompted me being uninvited to the discussion, which has now led to me to believe that the narrative is being controlled and we are not getting to see the true or full context of this study and where it actually fits within the South African context. So here we go. So for all those people that are not in South Africa or unaware of what's happening in South Africa, I think it's important that we highlight the backdrop as to when the study was conducted in 2023 and what faces South Africa in general, and in particular the youth, high school students in South Africa. And it's well known that South Africa is probably the most unequal society in the world. It has an incredibly high unemployment rate, anywhere up to from 32% upwards. We know that there is a lot of youth unemployment in South Africa, and that problem hasn't been resolved, and in fact, it's getting worse. We know that there is widespread poverty in the country, and a large percentage of South Africa's population rely on social grants. And during 2023, it needs to be noted that South Africa was facing enormous challenges around the provision or supplying of electricity. So we had an enormous amount of what we call blackouts or load shedding, where up to 12 hours a day there was no electricity for South Africans to use. So therefore, the economic impacts around that was huge. When we look at some of the key indicators or key statistics regarding the youth, we noticed that in 2023, it was estimated that 40% of kids who started their school career in grade 1 never made it to the end of their school career and had dropped out of school. 40% of South Africans' school-going youth or school-going kids had dropped out of school before finishing school. And we know that there are a number of factors that have contributed to this. Things like teenage pregnancy, social economic pressures, academic challenges, kids not getting the correct education. There's a whole host of factors that have contributed to this dropout. And in all honesty, I believe has contributed to a lot of stress that kids in South Africa are facing. And we're having a large portion of our population that are uneducated. So unless you've been living under a rock in South Africa, you would have noticed that since December of 2024, there has been this ongoing reporting around youth vaping in high schools, and that it's a huge concern. And I must be honest, as a father, it is a concern, and I think there are things that need to be addressed and challenged. But what I want to discuss around this is that youth vaping only affects a very small part of the adolescent population of South Africa. And I'm going to use the data that I collected from this particular study and align it to other data sources to try to demonstrate this. And I believe that the context and the bias that is seen in this research has not been clearly expressed enough, or not been clearly expressed at all in some cases. And as always, if you disagree with what I'm saying or have an alternative view, I am happy to stand corrected, and please provide that in the comments or reach out to me on my email address, and that is info@vsml.co.za. So let's just take a look at some of these things. So what we do know is that there were 90 schools that were invited to participate in the study. But one of the prerequisites of this particular study was to have a digital survey that was hosted on an internet service called SurveyMonkey. And what was required is that the schools have access to internet and the tools in order for them to do that particular survey on the internet. And there are a number of schools that had declined due to the case that they did not have internet access, and as well as many other reasons. But what was settled on was that 52 schools participated in the survey. Now, if we look at the Department of Basic Education's annual report of 2022 to 2023, it is clearly indicated that only 10% of the schools in South Africa have the facilities of internet for teaching and learning. So that would mean, based on that, is 90% of the schools in South Africa do not have access to the internet, and therefore were automatically excluded from this particular survey, given that fact. What we also know is that these schools were then broken down into 3 price categories or paying categories. South Africa has, in the education system, have a quintile system. There are 5 quintiles plus the private schools. Quintile 1, 2, and 3 are typically the poorest schools in the country, and they relied heavily on government funding. And in fact, in most of those schools, the students' fees are paid by the state. And then we have quintile 4 and 5, which are typically fee-paying schools, and those fees are typically paid by the parents of the students attending those schools. There has been some changes over the years where the state does pay a certain percentage or certain amount to every student, and depending on the quintile will determine how much is being paid. In this particular study, given the 52 schools, they looked at the annual fee for those schools and put them into three categories. And the three categories is the lowest, which is 20,000 to 40,000 per annum per student. And the highest is anything over 90,000, up to well over 300,000 is what has been reported in the study. But generally, we are looking at schools where the students' fees are paid by the parents, anywhere from over 2,000 rand a month up to 15,000, and those are the medium fees of those schools, as indicated in this table. This data that has been presented is directly taken out of the study itself. So then I went and looked at, for example, I looked at the Department of Basic Education's data set, and kudos to the department. You have a fantastic data set that every quarter you present how many schools there are out there and give them the categories of the schools, where the schools are found, whether they're fee paying, whether they're not fee paying, the quintile, the addresses, the number of students, the number of teachers. A fantastic set of data that is updated by the looks of it every quarter, and I relied on that data set to highlight the discrepancy of fee-paying schools versus non-fee pay schools. And the quintile would obviously determine as to what represent. I believe that this particular cohort for this study found itself in the quintile 5 and private school. I don't believe that was in any of the other quintiles. However, it's very difficult to make that to be very clear in that. That's what I believe. So yeah, this particular graph shows an indication of the difference between the fee-paying schools and high schools in South Africa versus the no-fee schools, high schools in South Africa. Data directly from the Department of Basic Education. The same graph, now looking at the actual students or learners of these schools, and again we can see that the overwhelming majority of high school students in South Africa fall into no-fee schools. Another bit of information that is not clearly expressed in any of the reporting that I've seen and is very helpful into determining the bias, the selection bias of the study, is that 69% of the learners or students in the study participated in a single-sex school. And it is quite clear that this is the minority of schools in the country. There is very few single-sex schools in South Africa that the majority of the students participated in this study. Unfortunately, or fortunately, there is two associations in South Africa that lists these single-sex schools, and therefore I took the next approach of taking these schools and then providing just some details around where these schools are, how much these schools are per annum, and those are 2023 figures. And I must be very clear that nowhere in this particular study were any of the schools mentioned. This is an assumption based on the data that was provided in the survey. Fee-paying schools and the majority of students participated or attend a single-sex school. So yeah, we have a list of 28 schools that meet that criteria, single-sex schools, are fee-paying and are registered as public schools and fall under the quintile 5 section. You can pause anytime and just take a look at the schools with more detail. But what you can clearly see is that these schools don't meet the typical high school in South Africa. So those are the schools. Again, there was no list of schools in the study. That was just purely based on details that were provided around the study. Something that I also found quite atypical in this particular research is that when we looked at the participants' demographics, gender was catered for, age was catered for, grade was catered for, but what was missing was the racial demographic. And I had then gone through a process of understanding what Lancet's expectations are with regards to studies of this nature, a cross-sectional observational study to do with the population. And it's recommended, highly recommended, in their case explicitly recommended, that racial and ethnic categories or demographics are included in the study. Nowhere in this study do we see any classification or categories based on the race. Now, I'm not sure if this was intentional or if this data was even collected, but based on my understanding, given the fact that the majority of South Africans happen to be black and the minority groups consist of whites, mixed race, which we call colored, and Asian descent are the minority of population groups, I would expect to see some level of racial demographic when we are talking about high schools in South Africa. I might be wrong. I hope I am wrong that this was intentionally left out, whether it was left out in the design or left out in the reporting, that if they had highlighted the number of students based on their ethnicity or their race, would highlight how the selection bias of this study would come to the fore. It would just clearly indicate that this looked at a very, very specific set of individuals in the country. I hope I'm wrong, but as I said, I find this atypical of a study of this nature to not include race or ethnicity in their demographics. So based on this particular thing and the limitations that they had clearly expressed in the study, is that this particular survey was conducted on a very small set of individuals, affluent students attending affluent schools in the country, and ignored, in my view, the overwhelming majority of high school students in the country. So then let's look at some of the figures that have been seen in the media and where they come from and how they're calculated. So we do know that there were 52 schools that were selected, and we do know that there are 25,149 students that participated in the survey. We also know that the survey was done on an internet web page, a web service called SurveyMonkey, and we do know that the survey lasted literally between 5 and 7 minutes. So there was a very small set of questions being asked. And what we do know is, based on the results, that 4,189 of the 25,000 learners had indicated that they were current vape users. What's not clear, what clearly is expressed in many of the reporting, what defined a current vape user is if they had used even one puff in the previous 30 days of taking that survey. That determines a current vape user. One of the key percentages that have been highlighted is the 16.8% of students, which gives us the 4,189 known current vapors in this particular cohort, in this study. But one of the key percentages is that they indicate that near 55% of students who vape vape for 4 or more days in a week, and that 38% of these students who vape are vaping daily. However, what is not clearly expressed that this is based on a smaller denominator, and that's the 2,997 that I've highlighted there. Effectively, almost 30% of the respondents did not answer this question. So can we make an assumption that those individuals had only vaped maybe once in the last 30 days, maybe twice over the last 30 days? And if we take a look at the figures around more than 20 days in a month, we're looking at around about 6.6% of these known vapors vape for 20 or more days in a month. Another very, very important statistic that has been presented in the media is how soon after a learner had woken up do they have to take a vape. And the figure of 47+% has been bandied about in the media for forever now, or at least since December. And again, I need to highlight the fact that this was based on a denominator where more than 70% of the responses were missing. That 47% that they refer to is based on less than 30% of responses. Then we look at, for example, cannot get through a whole school day without vaping. And the figure of almost 12% has been bandied around in the media and shared on numerous newspaper articles. Again, this is based on a very smaller denominator, and that is literally relying on 55+% of missing responses. Then kids feeling anxious if they haven't vaped for a period of time. Again, this is based on a much smaller denominator. Over 61% of the responses were missing from this question, and it relies on only 1,627 responses of the 4,189 students that have said that they were indicated that they had vaped. So again, a denominator that is smaller than the known figure. And I must remind you that this is always referring back to what has been reported in the media, is that high schools, people that vape, it doesn't look at the people that vaped. It looked at the responses of that particular question to define that percentage. Then finally, which I find rather peculiar, is that people that are close to the space have known that a very, very cool or very widely used and almost the default of measuring nicotine dependency is using a system that was designed by Professor Cole Froggerstrom in the 80s, I believe, and that is a true indication of nicotine dependency and has been used widely. In the study, it was highlighted that they did not use the Froggerstrom's nicotine dependency test and had created their own novel way of doing that. And that way was having two dependence scores based on the answers provided. The dependence score number 1, which you see here in the top right-hand corner, is relying on the answers around a number of vaping days each week and the time of waking up before you have your first vape. Again, the denominators are really small there. More than 70% of those responses were missing. And then a dependency score number 2 was based on needing for vaping during school and feeling anxious if you haven't vaped for a long time. And that figure is what's being reported by the authors of the study, where they say that we estimate that up to 61% of high school learners who vape could be seriously addicted to nicotine. That 61% is based on 743 responses, where over 82% of the responses were missing. Again, there is what you could say is that 743 of the known vapors of 4,189 calculates to around 17%, almost 18%. And if you want to take it even further, that would mean that only 3%, 2.9% of the cohort of 25,000 are considered to be highly addictive to nicotine vapes, or in this case, just addicted to nicotine. So that is, in essence, what we are looking for with regards to the percentages in the survey. Now, again, I do stand under correction and I might get this completely wrong, and I invite anybody to share their opinion or views as to what was being presented here. I'm always open to be corrected, and please post those concerns or those different views in our comment section, yeah, or if you want to reach out to me directly, you can get hold of me on info@vsml.co.za. But the most disturbing part of this whole scenario is the amount of focus that has gone into what is clearly a very, very small subset of the adolescent population of this country, because it does not include the majority of high school kids that are in lower income groups, that attend schools that are poorly equipped, that don't have internet services, in some cases don't even have proper sanitary, are overcrowded in their classrooms. And I am really concerned that we ignore the population that needs us the most and needs the greatest amount of focus. And instead, we've invested so much time and effort onto a subset of the population, which I think is important. We need to highlight that there is an issue in this particular cohort, but we should never ever sell it as being high school students. They're not the average typical high school student in South Africa. They are a very small subset of the adolescent population. If you consider that 40% of students or students in South Africa drop out before they even finish high school. And I can only imagine what percentage of that population of dropouts actually participate in very risky behaviors, including smoking, drug abuse, alcoholism. So I am of the opinion, if we want to talk about adolescent health, we should look at the entire adolescent population and be very clear that some population groups are affected disproportionately to others around certain substances. It's very clear that high school kids coming from rich areas where their parents or their situation is of a much higher economic status or standard will naturally use vaping, whereas the majority of South African students that find themselves in very disparate situations will not be in the position to buy vaping products. In fact, I would believe that they are more likely to be using illicit cigarettes if they are consuming nicotine. And we've seen these in reports time and time again where kids have died in shebeens or taverns due to fires. We've seen an increase in youth pregnancies. And those are all part of the normal, or normal's a bad word here, but the typical life of a South African adolescent. It's not what we see in the study. And although I think the study of this nature is important, I think what's far more important is that we need to expand our scope and the set to look at all adolescents in this country and how nicotine is impacting them, which would then provide better understanding to create more appropriate regulations and policies to address those situations. Let's face it, the kids in these schools probably have their own credit card or debit card provided by their parents. They probably have, or more than likely have, access to the internet 24/7. They have devices that will provide them access to internet, to social media, and they probably are dropped off at school every single morning. That's not the typical average South African student's life. And I believe the study and the way that's been reported does not reflect that clearly enough. And that's very, very sad that we are seen so much attention and so many headlines around this particular cohort when we ignore where the real need and the real problems might be occurring, just so that we can continue with the narrative that vaping is bad. And again, I do not endorse youth vaping. But I believe that this particular study and what we're seeing in the media is being used to pressurize policymakers in signing a tobacco bill that would cause far greater issues and far greater problems if we consider the problems that we are facing with illicit cigarettes in illicit markets as a whole in South Africa. This bill would just open the floodgates to a product that could very well be seen as a solution to the smoking problems in South Africa. So thank you very much for your time. Again, if you have any comments on this particular video, please share it in the comment section below. If you like what I'm doing and believe that I'm on the right track, please subscribe to this channel. And more importantly, because I've been silenced with regard to this matter, share it. Let everybody know that there is a side that's not being clearly represented. So again, thank you very much and have a great day. Cheers.